You are listening to the Practicing the Art of Small Business podcast with Shannyn Merlo and Julie Parker. Join their conversation about business, leadership, and the self-awareness journey to greater success.
Welcome to Practicing the Art of Small Business. Welcome, Julie Parker.
Hello, Shannyn Merlo. I'm excited about this topic that we've got today.
I'm excited too. What episode number are we at, or does it not matter anymore?
Well, it's number 9, but, a few years down the track, we'll be talking about it's number 980. So, look, what are numbers now?
Well, especially given that to our listeners, Julie sent me a message saying, can we delay a little bit? And I said, absolutely. I was so excited knowing I was going to talk to you today. So, yes, we both are enjoying this so much, I think. Yeah, 980, good goal.
Yeah, that's right.
It's going to be what? How many years ahead of that? That's going to be a lot.
I won't be repeating one single topic.
Not at all.
So today's topic is asking the question, can you do business with friends, family and partners without killing each other? I don't know if it's possible. What do you think, Shannyn?
Well, it's interesting because as we started to kind of go through just brainstorming this topic, we started off as friends before we started this podcast, and you work with your partner, and you mentioned you also work with your sister. Mm. And this came about because I've been considering working with a friend of mine, bringing this friend of mine into my business on certain levels. But there's also lots of family businesses and partnerships that start off with friends. And so it's an interesting topic. So I know I've heard some pretty interesting stories of when things go bad. But Julie, given that you've worked with your husband Charles for a while now, do you want to share with us what happens when it goes good? And then maybe we could share how we started our collaboration here and some of the things that we've put in place in order to make sure that our collaboration stays amicable and love-filled.
I love it. Well, I think with my history, I've gone and worked in many dental practices that have been owned by singular practice owners or colleagues that buy into the practice, but also husband and wife teams as well. And so I have had a bit of exposure into how things can go pear-shaped and how things can go well. And what I do with Charles is, as a result of those experiences that I've seen in the past, the situations I've seen in the past, is I've approached working with Charles as if I was approaching working with any other professional person. And so I think what can sometimes happen is this person loves me, is forgiving of me when I don't do the dishes, when I leave the toilet seat up or down, or forget to mow the lawn or whatever. All of these things, this person loves me. And so they take the good with the bad. They understand that there's benefits and drawbacks. Generally, hopefully, you offer more benefits than drawbacks. And so it makes it a little bit easier for them to look over the bits and pieces and ignore the bits and pieces that others may find irritating. And we can sometimes bring that expectation or that sense of reality into the working relationship. And I think that's where it's wrong that you do that. Mm-hmm. Because when we fight about something or argue about something within a marriage, for example, not that Charles and I fight ever.
Ever.
It's a
basically like the Care Bears.
Yeah, that's right. It's a family of Care Bears here. And you can get quite narky with each other. You can bring up old hurts with each other, and you can have all of the emotional baggage that you bring with you to each of those sort of negative interactions. If you did that with a working environment, you would never get past the first fight. So I think we have the inclination to interact with each other as partners in a loving relationship in a way that is unhelpful in a working relationship. And to identify that these are different types of relationships, and in order for us to have happier results, we need to behave in different ways. What do you think about that?
It's interesting you say that, because I had a discussion with someone who I am not in a business relationship with just recently. And we had conflict. There's a collaborator that I'm working with, and we'd had certain conflict or communication challenges, let's call it that. And there'd been a number of incidences. And when we spoke in recent times, I said to this person, it feels like your emotional bank account, and for those in relationships, there's this emotional bank account, and you want to keep your bank account saved. You want to keep investing in your emotional bank account so it's nice and healthy. And if you do things within the relationship that depletes the emotional bank account, you end up in the red. And that's when things blow up. When you're in the relationship, someone forgets to stack the dishwasher and then all heck breaks loose. Now, I said to this collaborator, I said, it feels like the emotional bank account is in the red, but we can't keep dragging baggage into our communications. If we've dealt with an issue, we've got to assume that the issue has been resolved. If it hasn't been resolved, then we can't move forward. But I believe that you can't carry baggage in a business relationship, because you've always got to have at least a ground zero, or after a conversation, assuming that the conflict has been resolved and everything is A-OK, then that should have invested enough in the bank account that you're already reinvested. I do think that you can't carry baggage in a business relationship, because
it doesn't work in either relationship, does it? Nice life lesson as well. Like, if you are dragging all the old failings into every argument, how are those arguments resolving? I don't think they would be. I think people would recognise that just complicates it even, and the other person can't even win. Can't win. I can win this argument. I can't win the last 20 all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And I think, interestingly enough, we started out as friends, as we've spoken about, and
we're still friends. Thank you.
Yes, for the record, episode 9 still going strong.
Today we're friends. Yeah.
Remember the time? And when we started this, we had a discussion of, how do we make this work? How do we ensure that our relationship stays firm, that we hold values? How are we going to communicate? What's the way we're going to work? And we've also navigated a number of the roles in our relationship. And I keep expressing to you where I think that there's an unfairness. And when I say unfairness, it's mostly that Julie's doing all the technical work and I'm not doing it.
So treats me badly.
So the unfairness is definitely on Julie's side, for the record. It's recorded now.
I hold you to it.
But I think that you and I set a really good baseline of, okay, what are the values that we're going to hold? How are we going to communicate? What are our roles going to be? And also, I'm very conscious of making sure that there is an even exchange of energy. And when I say energy, people, energy is sort of everything. It's what we both bring to the relationship. It's the amount of work that each of us does. It's the pain and suffering that we inflict on each other, and
our listeners,
or the love and opportunity that we give to each other. And so in any of these relationships, there needs to be an equal exchange of energy. And Julie and I think, are navigating pretty good at episode 9. We'll check in at episode. What do you think about those little reflections and thoughts that I've had, Julie? Feel free to come back at me and say there isn't an even exchange of energy.
Well, you've identified, as you so often do, very clearly and succinctly, very early on in the podcast, what needs to happen. That continued open and frank communication.
Oh, well, that's it. The podcast is done.
See you all next time. And that is true for any relationship, isn't it? You can formalise it and put more structure to it in a working relationship a little bit more easily, I think. Let's meet up every week, every Friday. Let's talk about how we're both going. Let's, what was the Seinfeld episode for Festivus for the rest of us? Now's the time that we air our family grievances. So give yourselves that structure. Giving yourself that structure in a working relationship, I think, is a more straightforward process in a personal relationship, but it's worthy in both relationships, of course. So that continued open communication and safe communication too. So how many times have you come across, Shannyn, bosses that say, oh, yeah, I've open door management. They can come to me anytime. But you ask the employees, can you go to them anytime? Oh, yeah, if I want to be berated.
Absolutely.
So and this comes back to the stuff that I talk about with teams, and I'm sure that you do as well. When we start talking about culture in a team, in a business that we're going into, it is an effective way of managing communication with each other, with team members, is developing agreements as a team of how we're going to behave. So if things don't go great, this is how we agree to behave around that. If things go great, this is how we agree to celebrate. This is how we agree to communicate when things go good, bad, and everything in between.
Julie, as always, just prior to you saying that, I had written as a talking point to come back to setting expectations. Because when you were talking about the structure of the relationship and having a meeting, I think that when you can set an expectation of, in this meeting, we're going to discuss any outstanding issues that are here, it gives people permission to actually speak and to know that they're in a safe place to communicate their needs and their challenges and their desires. So I think, as just going back to your point around having a structure, I think that can set an expectation of what we're going to talk about, and that this is a safe place to communicate your needs and your challenges. Because I think if the structure isn't there, then we often just go, oh, I'll wait for the next time. I'll wait for the next time. I'll wait for the next time. But I do want to have that as a caveat with your comment with regard to agreements on behaviour, because I think that when there's an agreed agreement on an agreed behaviour, and that behaviour has not been done, then I think that the communication needs to be very swift in order to address the issue as quickly as possible, because otherwise it becomes one of these big monolith problems, which could have been addressed by saying, hey, Julie, I didn't like how you, whatever, what do we do about that? That's actually, we agreed that we were going to do it differently. What do we do? And presumably, because we share similar values in terms of openness and growth and all the rest of it, you would go, you're right on. Thanks for calling me out. Really appreciate it. What a great growth opportunity. So grateful to continue working with you. And we would go happily hand in hand.
Are we skipping as well?
Yes, please.
Amongst daisies. That sounds delightful. And again, I think you've hit on an interesting point here. I believe you are less likely to kill each other when you work with friends, family, and partners if you are pretty much on the same level of self-awareness. I think the challenge can come when you work with somebody that it is difficult to relate to because you're in kind of different worlds. You process things differently. You take different levels of responsibility over your actions and responses. You communicate differently. And I think one of the reasons why you and I are still friends at episode 9 is because we are of the same relative level of self-awareness. What are your thoughts around that?
It is a really interesting point. I agree. And I also agree, like, my baseline is the values that we hold. And because we can not work on the same... You're super productive. Julie showed me her calendar the other week and I was just blown away. I was like, oh my God. So
I sound awesome.
She is awesome. I was like, no wonder you get so much done. Now, I am currently working a little bit differently to Julie on that level, but our base values in terms of wanting the best for each other and the best for this podcast and the best for our listeners means that it really doesn't matter whether Julie's calendar is color-coded and mine's, let's not worry about what mine looks like. There's still that mutual respect of what are the higher orders of how we work with each other, how we communicate with each other, how we deal with conflict, and going back to those behaviors. So I do agree with that. level of self-awareness. But I suppose that's part of our values anyway, of respecting each other, growing, using every opportunity as an opportunity to better ourselves. So any conflict that I think that we're going to have that will arise will always be an opportunity for us to reflect and to grow from and to develop a deeper relationship. So I think that is self-awareness, but it also is our baseline, how we see the world and how we experience the world.
Yeah. So by the time we do get to episode number 980, if we are more connected than ever, it's because we've had an enormous amount of conflict.
Another thing that you pointed out before as well, we had a discussion about at the start, we wanted to have about a 50-50 contribution into creating this. Mm-hmm. All the back scenes, behind the scenes work as well. And that's the case when you're working with friends, family and partners as well. You know, if it's a joint business, let's make sure that we're both putting in 50%. But recognising that's quite unrealistic. Because if you keep striving for the 50-50 expectation, then the minute it's out of whack, someone's resentful, someone feels like they're doing a bit too much work. And we recognise from the start that given our working lives, that's going, and given the tasks that are required, that is going to change over time. So sure, at the start, it may be out of 50-50 balance. It might be 70-30. But then given the different types of tasks that need to be done to maintain the podcast, given the different time challenges that we each have within our own businesses, then it sways the other way for a period of time as well. So I think having a very realistic look at how much effort, productivity, ideas, all of that stuff, is 50-50 actually realistic moving forward?
I don't think it is. And I think this is a really interesting point. So when I speak with business owners about going into partnerships, whether it's a friend, most partnerships come about through people meeting each other and developing some sort of relationship from a friendship and then moving forward. There are two things that I always say that's really important. One is get really clear on the values that you guys are going to hold while working with each other. And yes, ideally that there's the business's values, but how you work with each other. What are your fundamental core values of working with each other? And my fundamental core value, the thing that drives me in my personal life and my business life, is about communication. So I totally believe that everything can be solved with good communication. And so when we haven't had a conflict yet. I mean, we nearly did this week where I was promoting episode 2 and Julia promoted episode 3. That was profound.
That was so funny because when you wrote, we nearly had our first fight. This is how text messages don't really relay their message properly. You said, "Oh, we nearly had our first fight." I'm like, "Oh my God, what did I write in my last text message?"
That's sort of a fundamental value that I share. And so what that means is, if I have any issue, you know that I'm going to be communicating that with you. And my expectation of you, given that we share similar values, is that you're going to do the same. And we had that conversation. The other thing which a lot of business partnerships don't do, and it probably also happens if you are working with someone and it's kind of a loose, it's not a direct partnership, but it's kind of a loose, help me out here, is having definite roles and responsibilities and key performance indicators that you're each going to hold the other person accountable to. A lot of partnerships I've found has been there's the one person responsible for, let's say, marketing and another person responsible for sales, but we're both going to do a little bit of sales, and a lot of resentment comes out when the business isn't working successfully, sales are depleting, and one of the partners says, it's probably more actually, I focus on operations, you focus on sales and marketing, but we'll both do a bit of sales, we'll both do a bit of networking. Now, if the sales targets are not being met, the loose, we're both doing sales, it's like, well, I'm too busy doing operations. You're supposed to be doing sales. It's your fault that we're not growing. But because the roles and responsibilities and the key performance indicators for those roles and responsibilities were not laid out in the first place, then there's not the basis of holding each other accountable and having the structured meeting to say, where are we at with the key performance indicators that we were going to hold each other accountable to? And that way you can address those issues off the bat. So I agree that in some cases there's a 50-50 split, but I think that there's less structure often put into these partnerships because we come in good faith and we hope that it all works out. But then when conflict happens, if there aren't those, what we spoke about before, those expectations, here's how we're going to deal with these things, here are what our baseline beliefs and core behaviors are going to be. If that hasn't been established, then that's when the bank account gets read and we stop talking to each other. And
I think if it gets to that stage, you might want to start to do this at the very start. It may be in response to things getting a little bit anxious between the two of you. But I think it's always worthwhile in getting on a regular basis, maybe once every 3 months, go to a therapist together with the sole purpose of helping to understand each other. Let's continue our journey of learning how to better communicate with each other and air our grievances, and without actually hurting one another. How do we maintain our friendship, our partnership, our marriage, while still getting everything required done for the business? And getting additional help, a third party coming in, is enormously helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's where being business coaches, we're not going to do marriage counselling, for the record. However, I've worked with partners who are married, and sometimes you've got to deal with some of those conflicts. Business and life are intertwined. So there are definitely having someone who can help facilitate the conversation and help bridge the gap can be really helpful no matter what the relationship.
Yeah. And I've got 2 marriages and business partnerships in mind that I'll quickly tell you about, because I think this raises a really key point. With couple number 1, we'll call them Bob and Sally. And Bob was the dentist and Sally was the practice manager. And there are many stories around the world of how that doesn't work. I thought it worked very well with this couple. And they had kids at home and all the rest of it, had a full family going on. I worked with them maybe for 6 years, and never once, not once, did I ever hear anything be raised that was an issue in their personal life. They never brought anything into that practice. They left it all at the door, at their front door, at their home, it seemed like, because it never infringed on what we were doing within the interactions of the practice. And I think that's a very helpful thing. The other thing that was very good for them as well is he was all the clinical side of things. And so he was in charge of, ultimately in charge of all the ordering of supplies, the training of the dental team, anything that went on in the surgery, he was in charge of. She did all of her further study and research and skills development around the practice management side and customer service and team interaction. So she really headed up that. And you could tell by the way we managed our way through little issues and all the rest of it, that the minute Bob, for example, said, well, we know that we all disagree on this, but this is my final word, so that therefore we're going forward with that, it was his final word. They didn't have a shared final word in that area. That was Bob's area, and same for Sally as well in her area. And the second couple I want to mention is just an extension of that. So we'll call this next couple Steve and Sonia. And Steve is a funny, fantastic personality type. And he's the dentist. She was a school teacher and then became the practice manager of the dental practice that they purchased. And we were talking one day about something, I can't remember what it was, and Sonia had said something. And Steve said, that's on the other side of the gold line. And then she just dropped it, and she didn't mention that issue again. I said, what is this gold line you speak of? Wow. And he said, well, you know how in typical dental surgeries there's linoleum or tiles in the surgery, then there's a gold divider, and that's where the carpet starts for the rest of the practice. That's the gold line. We never step over each other's gold line. Don't step over the gold line. And I think that putting that element of structure around who's got primary responsibility or ultimate responsibility and accountability to certain areas and what are our roles here, I think really clarifying that in such a fun, firm way. Don't go over the gold line. It helps to have that as a firm boundary in place without telling that other person to back off. Sonia?
Interestingly enough, I wrote down value the differences, the contrast. I've often seen really successful marriages and actually business partnerships where each party has a complete opposite personality style to the other party. So if you do disc profiles, which is what I often look at, there's a contrast between the two parties. And it's what makes them very strong in a relationship, in any relationship, because one person might be, you're familiar with DISC, Julie?
I am.
Yeah. Okay. So for our listeners.
Myers-Briggs personality profiling.
Yeah. So DISC is a personality profile. There are 4 elements. D stands for decisiveness. I is influencing. S is for stabilizing, and C is for compliance. And let me just give you a D and a C reference. So D, decisiveness, someone who's a big picture thinker, makes decisions quickly, very outcome orientated. C, compliance, think of your bookkeepers and your lawyers. They like detail, they like specificity, they like following the rules. Very, very different. They're both task orientated thinkers, but they're very different in the way that they want to experience the world. So the C person is very detailed. We've talked a little bit about this in previous podcast episodes. I think it was in our last one, actually, where we were talking about big picture and little picture people. So your C person is very, very detailed. They're ticking all the boxes. The D person doesn't want to tick any boxes. Now, if we can see the beauty and the contrast between these two styles, and no one is just purely D and purely C, but just for the example. Now, if we can see the beauty and the contrast between these two people and leverage each of their strengths for the benefit of the greater good, then it's the sum of the parts that makes it great. However, if the D person, big picture, I don't want to get into the details, talk to me about KPIs and I'm going to lose the will to live, my eyes are going to cloud over. C person's like, I need the rules to be able to make the decision. I need to have a checklist. I need to have all of these things in place before I can move forward. If you can't understand that the other person thinks differently, then that's going to create conflict, because the D person's just like, just make the decision. C person's saying, but I need all of the details in order to make the decision. Now, if you are in this relationship, let's say, if you can identify the beauty in the contrast between the D and the C and go, how do I utilize this person because I don't hold this strength, then you actually, the two parts are greater than the two parts, the sum of the parts are greater than the whole, or something, whatever the saying is. So I think that when you're talking about partnerships, often people do look to find the contrast. I really value this person because they're very good at this and I'm not so good at that. However, that can get lost along the way, and that can become a frustration as opposed to an opportunity. And I think reminding each other of why the contrast is good is often really helpful in terms of appreciating and showing gratitude for the difference. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Oh, I love that completely, utterly and completely, because just because someone works in a different way doesn't mean they're going to not achieve the results that need to be achieved. And that's good. Again, it's good for any team. And all the lessons around how to work with friends, family and partners without killing each other are exactly the same lessons of how you work with anybody without wanting to kill them.
Just for the record.
You've just got laid in the added potential for complication of there's an emotional attachment there, so there's hurts there that could be experienced to a deeper level than if that person didn't mean the world to you. And so I think that's where that you do, we're going to interact this way at work, a little bit different from at home. So at home I say, hey, sweetie pie, before I ask you to do anything. And at work I'm just going to say, hey, Simone, instead. And that's going to be okay. That's not an indication of me caring for you less while we're at work. And I've got written down here the benefits and drawbacks as well. Charles Coves, again, magnificent husband, the one that I never fight with, which I actually don't, but no one can believe that, so. He talks a lot in his work about the benefits and drawbacks, that with every scenario, there are equal number of benefits to drawbacks. And you can't come across a scenario or a partnership or a working relationship that doesn't have both benefits and drawbacks. So when a drawback happens, like it's going to happen, you don't look at that as the end of the world, at the end of the friendship, end of the marriage. You embrace it. Hey, it was always going to be yin and yang here.
I think having that from the onset of going, we are going to have conflicts, how are we going to navigate that is a really helpful way of preempting it so that there's not resentment when it does happen. I wanted to make a point, Julie, because this came up because I'm looking at potentially employing a friend of mine in my business, which I mentioned. Now, the relationship wouldn't be a partnership. This would be someone who would work with me for a few hours a week, someone who I respect immensely, and I wouldn't invite them in to be part of the business if I didn't. One of the concerns that I have is that because it's ultimately, it's my business and I'm going to be calling the shots, I'm concerned of the risk of how do we keep that balance between, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm having this emotional crisis, sharing my issues because it relates to the business, but they're not allocating, because that's what we would do as friends anyway, probably on less of a deep level, because I suppose as friends, you're just like, am I just having an emotional crisis, and they would support you. But is there a risk? And I'm probably saying this because I fear that there is a risk that it's going to be all about me. Hey, it's my business. This is my hour that I'm paying for. You're just going to have to support me emotionally. How do I make sure that I'm giving back to the relationship so that there's still that friendship, even though we're going to be working in this relationship sort of scenario potentially? What are your thoughts on navigating this, Julie? Because this isn't someone who I live with. This is and this is not someone who we would normally talk maybe an hour a week. So in terms of working with each other for a few hours a week, we may actually need space. So then there's not the investment in the friendship. What are your thoughts?
Again, I'm coming back to regular teams, that in order to make sure that employees are happy in a business that is owned by another individual, and make sure that they are happy enough that they want to stay and contribute and become enthusiastic about the goals of the business itself, is to also find out what the goals of that individual are, what the values of that individual are, what is that individual trying to get out of the experience themselves, and be as committed to her journey as she is to yours within your organisation. So what are you seeking to get out of this? Are you wanting to get out of this just a bit of a paycheck? Wildly different to, no, I truly am passionate about helping people's working relationships improve because I've been in bad ones and it's terrible. I'd love to be part of that whole journey, that whole process, because then you can start to identify how that person is going to have the payoff. How are they going to experience the payoff? Is it going to be just funds, or is it actually going to be collaborating with you on client interactions and the relationships within a team itself?
I really wanted to make a joke and say, so what you're telling me, Julie, is it's not always all about me, is what I got from that, when it's about understand what the goals of the individual you're working with is.
Good tip. I support your feeling that it should be all about you, Shannyn. I really
So we've talked about partnerships. We've talked about friends a little bit. Is there anything different if we're looking at working with family? And often family businesses, it's something where you're drawn into doing it. You work with your sister. Is there anything different that we need to consider if we've got a family business? And pretty much most of the time, I don't know about your family, Julie, but I kind of want to kill mine. There's no way. I think I've identified that we wouldn't be able to navigate in my family, and therefore we're not going to work with each other, like navigate without killing each other. So we're not going to do it.
You way too much carnage. And that's a wonderful scenario that you kind of paint, because how many family businesses are out there, restaurants or produce suppliers or whatever, farms as well, that whether you want to do the industry or not, bad luck, this is a family business and you're part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it's the same. I think you've got to develop agreements. Who's responsible for what? How are we going to make sure each area is held accountable? How we're going to communicate with each other? And that separation of the way we communicate in the business is going to be different to the way we communicate personally. I think one of the fears that does come about, and this is one of my clients as well that came up maybe about a year ago, and where there's two siblings that own a practice together. And what happens if things just, tensions rise up and bubble up? And one of them had a fear that it meant it was going to be a fracture in their relationship itself. Once this was actually identified by the other person, they go, of course it wouldn't be. Our relationship is so much bigger to me than anything else. I would sell the business in a heartbeat before it fractured our relationship. And I think that needs to be clarified in family units, partnerships, and also friendships, that let's have this agreement. Let's be very aware what the most important things in this world are. And our relationships. I think it's worthy to have them as the most important thing. We can build businesses and build, employ new people to replace people that have gone on, but let's all make the agreement, have the agreement that if we feel like it's gotten to the point where it's negatively affecting our relationship, if we're going to choose to continue moving on together, we do seek help in how we communicate and get, go to therapy on a regular basis or get a coach to come in, or we say, no, we can't see how we're going to work together moving forward. And so we're going to be going our separate ways within the business so we can maintain our relationship itself. I think that when you are developing any kind of partnership as well within business, I think this is leading me on to say, have it at arm's length. Make sure you both get separate lawyers. You both have your separate contracts written up. Treat it at arm's length, because the emotions will just complicate it. And never go into that kind of relationship thinking we're close enough that, love will conquer all. It doesn't in business.
Great points, Julie. Is there anything else that we need to point out or reflect on, or have we covered that?
One of the things that I do like, Tony Robbins always says, copy perfection sort of thing. So if you do know of, or if you can reach out at networking events and through social media, are there any married couples that work together that do it really well, or family members that work together that do it really well, and friendships as well? Tell us what your advice is. Like, go to the people that are doing it successfully and finding it out what they're doing, and then copy it.
That's a great point. That whole great point. That's a really great point, Julie. So just summarizing, can you successfully work with friends, family, and partners without killing each other? I think we can. I think that what I got was about setting expectations and agreements on behavior. I banged on a little bit about values and talking about understanding your different personality styles and appreciating the contrast in those styles. We talked about setting roles and responsibilities, and also noting that if there's an expectation of a 50-50 share, it's not always going to be that case. We talked a lot about, this is my big one, but we talked a lot about communication, the importance of communication. I absolutely believe that checking in with each other on a regular basis and creating an environment of open communication, that you're in a safe place to express whatever you're feeling. If you're feeling anything that is to the detriment of our relationship, working or personal, then we need to address that. We talked about going to ground zero after a conflict, but basically clearing out any baggage after a conflict, particularly in business, because you can't keep dragging the baggage, because it's going to end up in a divorce. One way or the other.
That's when the killing each other happens.
That's when the killing each other happens. What else Is that all? Oh, and I appreciate and understand the goals and values of each of the individuals of the parties. I think even if there's a partnership, it's really good to understand we've got our business goals, but what are our personal goals in this business so that we're both working towards each other, the success of each other. I think that's a really great point you made, Julie.
Thanks, Shannyn. You're all magnificent. We're talking about end on a high for me. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is a reminder, if you are enjoying the podcast, please share it with your friends and network. That would be awesome. And leave us a 5-star review. We accept nothing less than 5 stars.
I was about to say only 5 stars. If you're thinking it's a 4, then just move on.
And a review would be also magnificent. Again, only if it's positive. So thank you so much, Shannyn. I really look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, listeners. Bye.